Hello guys and welcome to my new video. So today I decided to have a look at my first impression of Antorus the Burning Throne raid. I've got to do Antorus Heroic on board my Holy Paladin, my Restoration Druid. I got to do some of the normals, I got to do some of the pugs on my Resto Shaman. And this video is basically, I'm going to be talking about Antorus bosses, the boss mechanics, my favorite bosses, things that could be changed, the difficulty of Antorus, the bosses that I feel Resto Druids are great at, the healer. I might even talk about the healers that I feel are going to be really strong for Antorus Heroic and Antorus Mythic. So there's been a lot of chatter about the new raid. Of course, there's new content, people are excited, people are hyped up to start healing, to start DPSing, to start tanking. I guess the biggest talking point about Antorus is the difficulty. There's been so many people who've gone ahead of the curve on their first day in a pug who might not know all the tactics. First of all, I feel that pugging and things like that is a legitimate path in World of Warcraft. A lot of people progress through pugs because they don't have time to join guilds and things like that. But I find it really, when Antorus or when Argus the Maker, which is the last boss in Antorus, gets beaten by a lot of pugs on the first day, I feel it's just too easy. A lot of people will tell you that the difficulty is just way too easy, both on normal and on heroic. Argus the Maker is definitely not the hardest boss in the instance. I think for us personally, and from what a lot of people have told me this, the Coven of Shivarras or Shivarra tend to give the most issues to a lot of guilds, and that's because of the mechanics. Coven of Shivarra has abilities that basically are random. There's like a combo of abilities that you get that are going to be random, so technically there is a limited number of possibilities, so you can't prepare for it. But in a pug scenario, that's almost impossible. In a guild scenario, that's kind of hard as well. So it's one of those bosses where you have to wait and see the abilities that are going to happen and then adjust. Like, are you going to use a healing cooldown if that's going to happen? If the interrupt ads spawned, there's raid-wide AoE and you already used the cooldown previously, and you're like, oh, what do I do? How do we manage these cooldowns? It's really hard to actually prepare for it, which I think is really, really cool. You know why? Because introducing complexity, introducing communication, introducing team play without giving soaking mechanics, which I know Tomb of Sargeras was all about them soaking mechanics, is great. Not having soaking mechanics and having a communication, enabling communication is really, really cool, because I know everyone's sick of soaking mechanics. And I know one of the reasons why Kil'jaeden Heroic was really, really hard, or a lot of people, Heroic Kil'jaeden was actually a legitimate challenge for most mythic guilds. For most average mythic guilds, it was a legitimate challenge. I would say that killing Heroic Kil'jaeden was, if you kill Heroic Kil'jaeden, you can easily do the first 3 bosses in Tomb of Sargeras. You can easily do the first 3 bosses. Like, Hadgedan was a joke compared to what Heroic Kil'jaeden was. So that's why a lot of guilds, when they beat Heroic Kil'jaeden, they got their curve achievement. There was a legitimate joy. There was a legitimate joy. I would honestly say, like, good job. Good job, because it was a hard boss. It was a hard boss mainly due to the soaking mechanic, which everybody hates now. So Blizzard is looking at this and saying, how should introduce complexity without adding soaking mechanics? And I think they did that with Coven of Shivarra, and to some extent Aggramar. I think they did that because in Aggramar, it's the first boss that I've seen, or at least that I remember, that where legitimate CC in a raid environment is needed. You actually have to organize, you have to CC ads, Warlock banishes are OP, you have to communicate when the ads are gonna go through. Difficulty wise, it's not crazy difficult boss. It's actually not that hard. A lot of people will tell you that Coven of Shivarra is harder than Aggramar, but the Aggramar's communication and the CC is cool. I want to see more of that. I want to see more of CC in boss encounters. Like I said, one of my favorite bosses mechanically is Coven of Shivarra. In terms of healing, I don't like Coven of Shivarra from a Restoration Druid perspective. There's too much random AoE. You can't really prepare for it to the same extent. I don't really enjoy healing Coven of Shivarra on Heroic, but I think it's going to be better in Mythic. Aggramar, on the other hand, is a really fun healing boss. There's a lot of raid AoE going out. In terms of mechanics, CC is really cool. But going back to the difficulty, we saw that Heroic Jaden was legitimately hard. Argus is really undertuned, I feel. Argus was probably one of the easier bosses in Antorus. First of all, the whole death mechanic of the boss bringing you back from life, that almost like eliminates mistakes. I know there is a limited number of times you can get rest and things like that, but it really allows you to kind of mess up. In terms of mechanics for like range, or especially healers, in terms of mechanics for healers, there is basically none. You can almost say there is no mechanic, at least very few mechanics that you need to pay attention to. It's mainly the soul bombs or whatever, and besides that you can just stay in middle and heal. You can pick up the buffs, and I mean there's ways to min and max the encounter, but in terms of mechanics there really isn't that much going on. Now I enjoyed the last phase in Argus Worldbreaker where there's a lot of raid AoE damage coming out where you can actually start healing, but in terms of difficulty it is pretty easy. There is really no sense of accomplishment in doing Argus Worldbreaker, Heroic, or getting the ahead of the curve compared to what Kil'jaeden was. But like I said before, the difficulty of Kil'jaeden came from soaking mechanics. The difficulty of Argus is coming from lack of mechanics, I might say. But it's going to be really interesting to see what the mythic one is. So let's look at some other bosses. So first of all, when I say the difficulty, I know a lot of people are geared. Like, I mean, the Heroic drops 945, Normal drops 930. Normal is a walkover. Normal is free loot completely. You don't even need to know tactics on Normal. You just go in and just get it done. That's basically it. It's actually ridiculously easy. I know when I talk about the loot, before doing Heroic and Antorus, a lot of people were probably around 940 item level, or at least a lot of people were around that item level. So you are over gearing content. The difficulty is obviously not going to be super hard, but compared to Tomb of Sargeras, first of all, Tomb of Sargeras, the initial bosses were very, very easy. Only the very end bosses were hard, and of course, Kil'jaeden was hard. In Antorus is a bit different. You have Coven of Shivarra, which is quite hard, but probably the hardest boss in my opinion, Coven of Shivarra, because you can't account for it. Then you have Aggramar, which is, to be honest, is not that difficult, but it has cool mechanics in it. And then you have Argus, which is just not difficult. There is healing to be done, but in terms of mechanics, it's just not difficult. Now, let's cover some of my favorite fights, my favorite healing fights and things like that. So I know a lot of people will hate me for this, but Varimathras, Varimathras is probably as close to patchwork fight as you ever gonna get. This is on Heroic and on Normal. This is basically a tank and spank with limited amount of movement, limited amount of mechanics. You just, if you get a debuff, you run out and you go back in. If you get the arrow, you just stay behind the raid. One of the melee soaks it or whatever. It's basically a tank and spank with constant raid taking damage. Resto, Druid, Heaven. As a healer, I acknowledge the fact that mechanically this boss is boring as hell. As a Resto Druid, I acknowledge the fact that this is Heaven. It is so cool. I honestly feel that in a raid instance with 11 bosses, there should be at least one boss like this. I honestly feel there should be one boss where the DPS can go and say, look at my single target DPS, I can break those 2 millions now with my Pantheon trinkets. Or healers can go in and say, let's see the amount of HPS I can put out. It's literally just going to be like a race for HPS meters. Like, part of Varimathras boss encounter is the damage and healing meters. That's the part of it. It's literally a boss for the meters. Because there really isn't that many mechanics. I really like the damage patterns because it's great for Resto Druid. It's actually great for a lot of the healers. It's actually interesting to see how many stacking fights there are in Antorus. There's a lot of fights where AoE is coming in and a lot of the raid can be stacked. There's a lot of fights where that can happen, like Felhounds. Actually, there's actually, I think, a point in nearly every fight where the raid can be stacked up and there can be a lot of stacked healing done, which I feel Resto Shamans are going to benefit quite a lot from this. I want to see how the mythic turns out, if Resto Shamans are going to be even more powerful. I already consider Resto Shamans to be one of the best healers because of the utility that they provide. but also Resto Shamans can become best healers if there's stack fights. So maybe there is a possibility that Resto Shamans are going to become like best healers on top of best utility. That's a very general estimation for me, but I'm just interesting to see how many stacked up fights there are. Like tier 20 for Resto Druids could be very good for these fights, for a lot of the fights in Antorus, which is really cool. So one of my favorite fights in terms of healing is Varimathras. In terms of healing, in terms of damage patterns, I really like Portal Keeper Hasabel. I feel a lot of the raid damage is coming on timers, like that raid damage in 5, 4, 3, 2, and then like this priest can try out atonements and just snipe everyone. There is a lot of that happening in Antorus, but I feel Portal Keeper Hasabel, the portals is pretty cool concept, sending in different healers. There's a lot of stuff to avoid. There is constant AoE damage to some extent. It's a fun healer fight, I find it. Varimathras is a fun healing fight just because there's constant AoE damage, no mechanics whatsoever though. Aggramar, there's a lot of damage coming in. Antori High Command, I don't really care for it. Felhounds of Sargeras is pretty okay. Garothi Worldbreaker is whatever. King Garrett is cool in terms of your raid becomes almost like a 5-man dungeon because you can't cover everybody, you have to go split into different parts. So you almost have these little 5-man groups spread around the map. Your stat priorities, your gear choices are going to change because let's, for example, Resto Druids might be stacking more mastery because there's less people to cover, so you're gonna have 2 hots on everyone and things like that. Things are gonna change because you have these little groups. Imonar is pretty okay. I'm not Eonar, which is the tower defense. I feel Eonar, the tower defense one, is already boring. I feel it's a kind of a boss that I'm already bored of. I feel they really should have introduced some other mechanic to make it a bit more interesting. I feel mechanically wise, if you read a list of stuff to do on Eonar, you see these different ads, you see these different CCs, there's raid AoE and stuff. You have to go from middle, top, bottom platform. When you start actually doing the fight, you don't even have to do any of those. Only like half of your raid has to be paying attention, and you can beat the boss. I feel there should have been one more mechanic that should be much more punishing for Eonar to make it much more interesting. But in my terms, one of my favorite healing fights would be like Portal Keeper Hasabel. I like Varimathras. I like Aggramar's damage patterns. Argus is pretty good as well. But like I said, a lot of stacking up. Resto Shamans seem to be... There's a chance Resto Shamans are going to do really well. Overall, I feel Antorus is a pretty good raid. The mechanics are pretty decent. It's kind of sad to see Argus the Maker being this easy. I can see why Blizzard did this. I can see why Blizzard is overcompensating for what happened in Tomb of Sargeras. I'm just sad to see this happening on heroic difficulty, because I feel Tomb of Sargeras, in terms of heroic difficulty, was actually pretty bang on. It was a good balance. Mythic wise, Tomb of Sargeras was probably the worst raid ever in terms of difficulty. I think it was one of the hardest raid and the whole raid zones ever created, in terms of the amount of bosses there were before pre-nerfs, before nerfs. You have like Mr. Sajin, you had Avatar, you had Kil'jaeden, you had to some extent Maidens, but you had like 3 bosses that were insanely hard and could almost be considered as raid bosses, end bosses for a lot of the other raids. So I can see why Blizzard was playing it safe. I can see why Blizzard removed soaking mechanics, because we're all sick of soaking mechanics, and I can see why Blizzard is having a hard time to make encounters hard without introducing soaking mechanics. Now, I find it really interesting the way they did it. Coven of Shivarra, random abilities happening that you need to basically, they happen and you need to play to them. You need to think on your feet for those fights. You have Aggramar, where CC is needed. A lot of CC is needed, which is interesting. It's going to get more interesting in Mythic. But then Argus kind of was missing a mechanic or two. Argus was missing a punishing mechanic or two to make it much harder. I almost prefer if they would have made Argus too hard and then they would have nerfed it. rather than just having it too easy. And then they're not gonna buff Argus. They're not gonna make Argus harder because people already did Argus Maker. I almost would have preferred that they made it too hard and then they would have nerfed it and then people would have done it and then there would have been a sense of accomplishment. Right now it is just feels a little bit too easy. I'm liking the bosses though. In terms of melee, Felhounds and Coven of Shivarra is very melee unfriendly. There's quite a few bosses that favor dot classes, like you have Warlock, Shadow Priest and Balanced Druids with their tier 21, where your Moonfire and Sunfire is going to be like a huge portion of your damage. So you're gonna have like Felhounds where like there's spread AoE or two target spread the fight, where dot classes are going to be OP. You have Coven of Shivarra where basically melee are almost not needed at all. It's very melee unfriendly, which I'm not sure how it's gonna change up for mythic, but there's a high chance that no one's gonna bring any melee for Coven of Shivarra. Considering it might be one of the hardest bosses. We'll see if it's going to be one of the hardest bosses on mythic. If it is, people are going to min-max and melee are not gonna melee are not gonna have a good time on that boss. So a lot of melee DPS classes are kind of a little bit unhappy about how some of the Antorus bosses turned out. We have to see how they're gonna change. Dot classes are gonna be really good. Dot classes are looking extremely good. So this has been my overview, probably a little bit too long, of Antorus. Let me know how you feel about Antorus difficulty. Let me know if you got the curve achievement already on your characters on the first day or the first week it's been released. Let me know which boss you find to be the best in terms of healing, DPS, maybe tanking and things like that. Which mechanics do you find to be the best? Which one is the most interesting? Like I mentioned, in terms of healing for me, I enjoyed Portal Keeper. Hasabel, Aggramar is cool. Argus is alright. A lot of the bosses are pretty good. Varimathras is a HPS DPS fight. But thank you for watching this video. Let me know how you feel about Antorus Raid. And the hype continues. The hype continues.